The final area that we're going to look at is manufacturer's liability. Now, this was a particularly important area in times past. Why? Well, because as a consumer, you would buy a good from a retailer, not from the manufacturer. So there wasn't any what they call privity of contract, right? The manufacturer didn't have a contractual relationship with you, so you couldn't sue them for breach of contract. And in fact, this was the area where the tort of negligence, which we're going to do in the next couple of weeks, first arose. So what the Parliament has done is try to enact a series of legislations to protect consumers when it's the manufacturer who will be at fault if something goes wrong. Because when you think about it, the retailer doesn't make the product. So if there's anything wrong with its manufacture, it's the manufacturer's fault rather than the retailer's. And so this legislation is trying to sheet that accountability and responsibility back to the manufacturer. Now, a critical thing to understand is that the manufacturer's liability is strict. It's strict liability for safety defects, which is the only area we're going to look at. What does that mean? That means you don't have to show that the manufacturer was negligent or that there's any contractual duty or anything like that. If there is a safety defect in the product, the manufacturer is liable, whether they were negligent or not. So it's a much higher standard that the manufacturers have to meet. And obviously Parliament has done that because it says, well, you know what, they could hurt a lot of people if you mismanufacture something. And because you could harm a lot of people, we're going to make the standard very high. And so that's where this strict liability comes from. Now, the first thing that we're going to emphasize is that the liability arises under Section 9 and it arises for safety defects. Okay, so we're really only talking about something where there's a defect as to its safety, not its quality per se, etc. And what do we mean by a safety defect? Well, it's when the safety of a good doesn't match what people would normally be entitled to expect with regards to that particular type of product. So that comes back to the way the product's been marketed, packaged, any marks on the goods that kind of make any signs or give you an indication of their safety, any instructions that are given with goods, or what you might reasonably be expected to do with the goods. What does this mean in real life? Well, what safety defects are you actually responsible for? So let's take something like a chair, right? Normally, you would use a chair to sit in, etc. So it would have to be safe to sit in. And normally, you wouldn't use a chair, say, for instance, to make up scaffolding. You put planks between them and then put heavy weights on. And if you got on that and it broke, that's probably not a safety defect, right? So you're not responsible for every failure of the project, of the product that you've got, only for those things that it would normally be used for, or that it's marketed to be used for. So where it can become a little grayer is in things, well, what happens if you said that this was the strongest chair in the world and that it was marketed by having it being used as, say, a bit of scaffolding? You put a plank between two of them and people jump up and down and paint on it, and that's how it's marketed. Well, if they market it that way, then yes, it probably will have to have that safety standard. So there's no absolute test here, but we do have to remember that we've got to look at the particular product, how it's ordinarily used and how it's marketed and set out and what instructions are given with it about how it should be used. And that's also one of the reasons that you receive sometimes crazy instructions with things like, champagne bottles and say, don't open it next to your eyeball because it could pop out. Of course it can do that, but also they've got that on there, right? So you now have an instruction about how not to use it, and it can be a bit of a defense for the manufacturer in cases like this. So the first thing we need to identify is, has there been a safety defect under Section 9? The second thing we then need to do is to say, what are we liable for? And that's where these sections 138 to 141 come in. So if someone's injured, then it's Section 138. If anyone else suffers loss other than the injured person, it's 139. If it destroys goods, it's 140. And if it destroys land or buildings, it's 141. So that's how this section works. You have to show that there's a safety defect, and then one of these sections or more of these sections will apply to cover the harm caused. So let's take a specific example. Imagine I've got a bicycle and there's a safety defect. Okay, let's say I'd imagine that the frame breaks and that as a result of that, I get injured. Then what we have is a breach of Section 9, and Section 138 says I can get damages for that. If my bike broke and it ruined the computer that I had in my backpack, then that would require Section 140. So I would be using Section 9 to say that there's a safety defect. I'd be using Section 138 to say I had personal injury, and I would be using Section 140 to say it caused damage to my property. So that's the way that these sections come together. Okay, so that's it for consumer law. Remember that we covered off those key areas of why we need consumer law: misleading and deceptive conduct, consumer guarantees, and finally, just this one, manufacturer's liability. Next week, we're going to have a bit of a look at negligence.